Watauga County, North Carolina, November 1877. The first snow had already buried the high ridges when Duncan MacLeod began tearing up the floor of his half-built cabin. His neighbors, watching from the tree-line, shook their heads. The Scottish stonemason had spent 4 months laying a foundation most considered unnecessarily elaborate. Now he was destroying his own work, digging down into the frozen earth with a determination that looked like madness. "He's lost his mind," Samuel Bradley told anyone who'd listen. Bradley had built 17 cabins in these mountains. He knew what worked. Winter's coming, and that fool's digging a cellar in the wrong place. But MacLeod wasn't digging a cellar. What he was creating beneath that cabin floor would prove so effective that 40 years later, engineers would study his design. It would keep his family warm through winters that killed livestock in neighboring homesteads. It would consume half the firewood of standard cabins while maintaining temperatures that seemed impossible for the era. The secret? An ancient Roman technology that most modern builders had completely forgotten. If you want to discover the engineering principle that made this possible, the same principle modern homes waste thousands of dollars ignoring, hit that like button right now. Subscribe and comment below telling me where you're watching from, because I'm going to show you the exact measurements, the materials, and the physics that made this mountain man's insane floor system outperform everything his neighbors built. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll understand why the smartest preppers and off-grid builders are rediscovering this 2,000-year-old trick. Duncan MacLeod arrived in Watauga County in the spring of 1877 with his wife, 2 children, and a reputation. Back in Aberdeen, he'd been a journeyman stonemason, trained in techniques passed down through 5 generations of Highland builders. He understood stone the way other men understood timber, its weight, its grain, its memory for heat. His neighbors noticed immediately that something was wrong with his approach. Most cabins in these mountains sat on fieldstone piers, simple stacks that lifted the floor off the damp ground. Quick to build, adequate for survival. MacLeod, instead, spent 6 weeks laying a continuous stone foundation that extended 3 feet below grade. He selected each stone individually, rejecting pieces his neighbors would have gladly used. Wasting time, Bradley declared, watching MacLeod tap a piece of granite and set it aside. Foundation's foundation. Stone's stone. But MacLeod was sorting by density and heat capacity, though he'd never heard those terms. He was selecting sandstone and dense limestone, avoiding granite and shale. He was building for thermal mass, not just structural support. By October, when most new settlers were finishing their cabins before snow, MacLeod had only just raised his walls. The foundation descended deep, with strange channels and passages that served no purpose anyone could identify. "He's built a tomb," one neighbor joked. "Coal's going to come right up through that stone." Then MacLeod began removing the floor joists he'd already installed. He started digging beneath where the cabin floor would sit, creating a network of trenches that connected to his oversized firebox. The work was backbreaking. The logic was invisible. His wife, Margaret, defended him quietly. "Duncan knows stone," she'd say. "Trust his hands." But even she wondered, watching her husband excavate in November cold, whether they'd have shelter before the deep freeze came. The channels he was carving into the earth beneath their home formed a pattern. Parallel trenches, 18 inches apart, each one carefully graded to slope toward the firebox at one end and the chimney base at the other. "What are you building?" Samuel Bradley finally asked, unable to contain his curiosity mixed with contempt. MacLeod straightened, his hands split and bleeding from cold stone. "A floor that breathes fire," he said. Bradley walked away, convinced the Scotsman had lost his mind entirely. What Duncan MacLeod understood, and what his American neighbors had forgotten, was that Roman engineers had solved the problem of radiant heat 1,500 years earlier. The hypocost, an underfloor heating system that channeled hot air and smoke through stone passages beneath living spaces. Roman bathhouses had used them. Wealthy villas throughout the empire had employed them. The technology was brilliant, efficient, and had been abandoned during the Middle Ages in favor of simpler, less effective fireplaces. But in the Scottish Highlands, In isolated communities that built with stone because timber was scarce, fragments of that knowledge survived. MacLeod's grandfather had shown him a manor house outside Inverness, where the lower chambers stayed warm through February with fires that burned only in the morning and evening. The stone remembers, his grandfather had said. Feed a heat, it gives back slowly. Now, in the North Carolina mountains, MacLeod was reconstructing that principle with materials at hand and modifications for frontier conditions. The system was this. Beneath his cabin floor, MacLeod created a network of stone-lined channels, each one 2 feet deep and 14 inches wide. These channels connected directly to an enlarged firebox, not the small, inefficient boxes typical of frontier cabins, but a chamber measuring 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep, lined with 18 inches of sandstone. From this firebox, channels radiated outward in parallel lines beneath the entire cabin floor. Hot air and smoke would travel through these stone passages before finally escaping through the chimney. As they traveled, the surrounding stone would absorb their heat. The cabin floor itself would become a massive thermal battery, storing and slowly releasing warmth long after the fire died. The physics was elegant. While a standard fireplace radiated 73% of its heat straight up the chimney, MacLeod's system forced that heat to travel through 40 feet of stone channels first. The sandstone lining, chosen for its superior heat capacity of approximately 0.2 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit, would absorb and hold that thermal energy. When Samuel Bradley saw the finished channels, he laughed outright. You've built a smoke maze under your house. That fire's going to fill your cabin with fumes, and your family's going to suffocate before Christmas. Others agreed. The cabin raising, traditionally a community event, drew only MacLeod's immediate family. His neighbors watched from a distance, curious to see how badly the experiment would fail. The draft won't work, claimed Henry Morrison, who'd built chimneys for a decade. Smoke doesn't flow horizontal. It rises. Those channels are going to choke. Margaret MacLeod asked her husband quietly, one evening as they worked by lamplight, whether he was certain. Whether they shouldn't simplify, build something proven, survive this first winter, and experiment later. Duncan showed her the angle of his channels, a precisely maintained gradient of 1 inch per 8 feet of length, enough to assist natural draft without requiring impossible updraft. He showed her how the firebox opened into a vertical chase that created initial uplift, pulling air through the horizontal channels before the chimney's main column took over. It will work, he said, because Romans proved it worked, and because stone doesn't lie about heat. Still, doubt crept in during the final weeks. The system required more firewood up front to heat the thermal mass. It required careful fire management, maintaining heat without creating incomplete combustion that would indeed produce dangerous smoke. It required faith that ancient knowledge translated across oceans and centuries. On December 3rd, 1877, with the first major storm approaching, Duncan MacLeod sealed the last stone, laid the final floor plank, and prepared to light his hypocost for the first time. His neighbors, from their own cabins, watched smoke emerge from his chimney and waited for the experiment to fail. The construction details of MacLeod's system revealed an understanding of thermodynamics that most frontier builders lacked entirely. Each of the 8 parallel channels measured exactly 14 inches wide and 24 inches deep, dimensions MacLeod insisted on despite the additional excavation required. The width allowed adequate airflow while maximizing stone surface contact. The depth provided sufficient thermal mass without creating dead zones where heat couldn't reach. The channels themselves were lined with carefully selected sandstone blocks, each one measuring 8 inches thick. MacLeod rejected limestone for the channel linings despite limestone's abundance, because sandstone's porosity created superior heat retention. The outer walls of the channel system, however, used dense limestone, which conducts heat more slowly, creating an insulating boundary that kept warmth from dissipating into the surrounding earth. Between channels, MacLeod left stone pillars 18 inches wide to support the cabin floor above. These weren't simple stacks. Each pillar was constructed with interlocking stones, creating continuous thermal mass that connected the channels into a unified heating system. The entire network contained approximately 6,400 pounds of stone, positioned to absorb, store, and radiate heat upward through the cabin floor. The firebox itself demonstrated equal precision. Its 4-foot width accommodated logs up to 30 inches long, far larger than the 16-inch splits typical of standard fireplaces. This meant longer burn times and more consistent heat output. The firebox depth, 3 feet, allowed for a substantial bed of coals that maintained base heat even when flames died down. Most critically, McLeod angled the firebox floor at 12 degrees, sloping downward toward the channel openings. This created a natural draft path where hot gases, rising from the combustion, will be channeled horizontally into the hypocost system rather than shooting straight up into the chimney. Samuel Bradley, examining the system one afternoon when McLeod was away hunting, measured these details and found himself confused. "It's all wrong," he told Morrison. "Firebox is too wide, it'll lose heat. Channels are too long, draft won't pull." And he's buried thousands of pounds of good stone where it does nobody any good. What Bradley didn't understand was thermal lag and radiant efficiency. A conventional fireplace heated a cabin through convection, hot air rising directly from flames. When the fire died, the heat vanished within an hour. McLeod's system heated through thermal mass radiation, stone warmed to 140 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, releasing the heat gradually over 6 to 8 hours after the fire extinguished. The community pressure mounted as December deepened. Margaret's sister, visiting from the Valley settlement, urged them to abandon the experiment and move in with relatives for the winter. "You've got 2 children," she pleaded. "This stubbornness isn't worth their lives." Duncan, installing the final floor planks above his stone labyrinth, said nothing. He'd calculated the system's capacity, the amount of heat the thermal mass could store, the rate of radiation through white oak flooring, the equilibrium temperature achievable with twice-daily firings. His numbers suggested the cabin could maintain 65 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit interior temperature, even when exterior temperatures dropped to 0. His neighbors' cabins, he knew, would struggle to reach 50 degrees Fahrenheit under the same conditions, despite burning fires continuously. On December 18th, McLeod completed the installation. His cabin floor, unlike the rough planking in neighboring homes, consisted of carefully fitted white oak boards, each one dried and planed to exact thickness. Too thick, and the floor would insulate against the heat below. Too thin, and uncomfortable hot spots would develop. McLeod chose boards measuring 3/4 of an inch, sufficient to distribute heat evenly while allowing radiant warmth to penetrate. That evening, he lit the first true fire in his hypocost system. The family gathered nervously, watching smoke curl into the firebox, wondering if it would fill their home or draw properly through the channels. The draft caught. Smoke flowed through the stone labyrinth and emerged cleanly from the chimney. Within 20 minutes, the floor near the firebox began to warm. Within an hour, you could walk barefoot on oak planks that felt like sun-warmed stone in July. "It's working," Margaret whispered, but the true test was yet to come. The system needed to prove itself not on a December evening with moderate cold, but during the killing freeze that everyone knew was approaching, the kind of cold that settled into the high country in January and didn't release its grip until March. Samuel Bradley, seeing smoke from McLeod's chimney that first night, told his wife with satisfaction, "Give it a week. That stone will suck every bit of heat down and turn his cabin into a cellar." Fancy ideas don't survive mountain winters. January 12, 1878. The temperature dropped to 18 below zero. It came with a high-pressure system that settled over the mountains like a weight, bringing clear skies and absolutely still air, the kind of cold that splits trees and freezes livestock in their stalls. The cold descended over 3 days, and by the morning of the 12th, it had become dangerous. In Samuel Bradley's cabin, despite a fire burning continuously through the night, the interior temperature at dawn measured 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Frost formed on the inside of the windows. The water bucket near the hearth developed a skim of ice. Bradley's children slept in layers of blankets, their breath visible in the lamplight. The family burned through a week's worth of cordwood in a single night, feeding the fire every 2 hours to maintain even that inadequate warmth. Henry Morrison's family fared slightly better. His cabin, constructed with tighter chinking and positioned in a wind-protected hollow, maintained internal temperatures near 48 degrees Fahrenheit. But they too burned fires day and night, going through their winter wood supply at an alarming rate. Across the ridgeline, other families reported similar conditions. 40 degrees, 45 at best. Fires that consumed enormous quantities of wood while barely holding back the killing cold. 2 homesteads, newer families who'd underestimated their wood needs, abandoned their cabins entirely and moved in with neighbors. And at Duncan MacLeod's cabin, the interior temperature held steady at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. It seemed impossible. Samuel Bradley, fighting his own fire at 4 a.m. and watching smoke rise from MacLeod's chimney in the starlit pre-dawn, decided to investigate. He arrived as first light touched the high peaks, knocked, and was invited inside. The warmth hit him like a wall. Not the fierce, dry heat of a roaring fire, but deep, encompassing warmth that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The cabin's interior felt like October, not January. MacLeod's children played on the floor in light clothing. Margaret was preparing breakfast without shawls or blankets. "How much wood are you burning?" Bradley demanded. MacLeod showed him. The firebox held a moderate fire, substantial, but not the inferno Bradley maintained in his own home. "I build up twice daily," MacLeod explained. "Morning and evening. Let it burn hot for 3 hours, then let it die to coals." "That's impossible. You can't heat a cabin on 2 fires a day in this cold." "The stone does the heating," MacLeod said. "The fire just charges it." He invited Bradley to remove his boots and walk across the floor. The oak planks radiated steady warmth. Not hot enough to burn, but warm enough that bare feet found instant comfort. Near the firebox, the floor registered approximately 85 degrees Fahrenheit. At the far end of the cabin, the temperature was still near 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Bradley knelt and pressed his palm flat against the planks. The warmth penetrated deep into his hand. "How long does this last after your fire dies?" 6 hours minimum. 8 if I build a good coal bed. Then I rebuild. The mathematics was stark. In a 24-hour period during the brutal cold snap, MacLeod burned approximately 80 pounds of cordwood. Bradley and his neighbors were burning 160 to 200 pounds to achieve half the interior comfort. The hypocost system was operating at double the efficiency while providing vastly superior heat distribution. If you're starting to understand why modern builders should be studying this, and why your own heating bills might be exposing how much we've forgotten, hit that like button now. Subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to show you next is the exact physics that made this possible. The engineering principles that explain why this mountain man's crazy floor could outperform anything in these mountains, and most modern systems too. The cold snap lasted 8 days. Other families exhausted their wood supplies and resorted to burning furniture, fence rails, anything combustible. Duncan MacLeod maintained his twice-daily firing schedule and never felt urgency. His children played in comfort, while neighbors' children huddled in blankets. On January 20th, when the temperature finally moderated to 10 above zero, Samuel Bradley returned. This time he brought Henry Morrison and 3 other builders. They wanted measurements. They wanted explanations. They wanted to understand how MacLeod had achieved what shouldn't have been possible. "Show us everything," Bradley said, his tone stripped of mockery. "Every channel, every angle, every stone." MacLeod invited them to examine the system from below, accessing the crawl space through an exterior panel he'd built for maintenance. The men crawled beneath the cabin with lanterns and found stones still warm to the touch 12 hours after the morning fire had burned down. The thermal mass, charged by morning heating, was still releasing stored energy. Morrison, a practical man who respected empirical results, emerged from that inspection converted. "This isn't witchcraft. It's engineering. And we've been fools not to listen." The story spread through the mountain communities faster than the cold had come. The Scotsman's underground fire. the cabin that stayed warm on half the wood, the stone labyrinth that trapped heat and gave it back slowly, like a miracle that could be measured in degrees and cordwood consumption. Duncan MacLeod, who'd been called crazy for digging beneath his cabin floor, who'd been mocked for wasting time on Roman ideas when practical American solutions were right there, Duncan MacLeod had proven that the oldest technologies sometimes survive because they're the smartest. What made MacLeod's system so effective wasn't magic or luck. It was physics that Roman engineers understood intimately and that modern thermal science would later quantify precisely. The key principle: thermal mass and radiant heat distribution. In a conventional frontier cabin, a fireplace operated with approximately 15 to 20% efficiency. Of all the heat energy released by burning wood, only 15 to 20% actually warmed the living space. The rest, 73% on average, escaped directly up the chimney as hot gases. Another 7 to 12% was lost through conduction into the stone or brick of the fireplace itself, which typically sat against an exterior wall where much of that heat radiated uselessly into outside air. MacLeod's hypocost system inverted those numbers. By forcing hot gases through 40 linear feet of stone channels before allowing them to escape through the chimney, the system captured approximately 65% of the combustion heat. That heat transferred into the 6,400 pounds of stone surrounding the channels through direct conduction and convective contact. Sandstone, with its specific heat capacity of approximately 0.20 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit, could store enormous amounts of thermal energy. When MacLeod fired his system to full heat, raising the stone temperature from 60 degrees Fahrenheit to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, those 6,400 pounds absorbed roughly 102,000 BTUs, the equivalent of burning 20 pounds of oak cordwood, but captured and stored rather than lost up a chimney. The release of that energy occurred through radiation and conduction into the cabin floor above, which then radiated upward into the living space. This process was slow and steady. While a conventional fireplace created dramatic heat in its immediate vicinity and cold zones 10 feet away, radiant floor heating distributed warmth evenly across the entire cabin footprint. The temperature differential was measurable and profound. During the January cold snap, thermal measurements showed MacLeod's cabin floor surface, 75 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit average at conventional cabin floors, 38 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit average MacLeod's interior air temperature, 68 degrees Fahrenheit conventional interior air temperature, 43 to 48 degrees Fahrenheit. The comfort difference went beyond raw numbers. Radiant heat warms objects and bodies directly, rather than just warming air. A person sitting in a room at 68 degrees Fahrenheit with radiant floor heating feels warmer than someone in a room at 72 degrees Fahrenheit heated by convection alone, because their body is receiving infrared radiation from the warm floor surface. Henry Morrison, attempting to understand the system for replication, measured the firebox temperatures during active burning. MacLeod's combustion chamber reached 1,100 to 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit during peak fire, hot enough for complete combustion that minimized smoke and creosote while maximizing heat output. That intense heat transferred into the channel walls, which absorbed it and began the slow radiation process. The channel design itself demonstrated sophisticated understanding of fluid dynamics, though MacLeod would never have used that term. The 1 inch per 8 feet gradient created just enough assistance to natural draft without requiring impossible updraft. Hot gases, being less dense than cold air, naturally wanted to rise, but the channel system directed them horizontally first. The gradient helped them flow without stagnating. The limestone outer walls of the channel system served a second critical function. They insulated the heated stone from the surrounding earth, which would have acted as an infinite heat sink, drawing thermal energy away endlessly. By surrounding the sandstone thermal mass with less conductive limestone, MacLeod created a boundary that slowed heat loss and kept the stored energy radiating upward into the cabin instead of downward into soil. Samuel Bradley, studying these details, performed his own calculations. A conventional fireplace in his cabin consumed approximately 160 pounds of cordwood per day during severe cold and maintained 45 degrees Fahrenheit interior temperature. McLeod's system consumed 80 pounds of cordwood per day and maintained 68 degrees Fahrenheit, achieving a temperature 23 degrees higher while burning half the fuel. The thermal efficiency improvement was approximately 350%. McLeod was extracting more than 3 times as much useful heat from the same quantity of wood. Morrison wanted to understand the coal bed strategy. Why did McLeod insist on building substantial fires that burned hot and fast, rather than the low, steady burns most frontiersmen preferred? The answer lay in complete combustion and thermal charging. A low, smoldering fire produces more smoke, creosote, and incomplete combustion byproducts. It releases heat slowly but inefficiently. McLeod's hot fires achieved complete combustion, converting nearly all the wood's energy into heat rather than wasting it as unburned gases. Those hot fires also charged the thermal mass more quickly and to higher temperatures. Once charged, the stone released heat for 6 to 8 hours, maintaining comfortable interior temperatures without active burning. Then McLeod would rebuild and charge the system again. 2 cycles per day, morning and evening, provided continuous warmth with minimal fuel consumption and optimal efficiency. The system's only weakness was startup time. From cold, it took 3 to 4 days of continuous firing to bring the full thermal mass up to operating temperature. But once operational, it maintained itself beautifully on the twice-daily schedule. This initial heat debt, the time and wood required to charge the system, had been one of Bradley's original objections. "You'll burn more wood getting started than you save all winter," he'd claimed. McLeod's records proved otherwise. Across the full winter season, November through March, his total cordwood consumption was 4,200 pounds. Bradley's cabin consumed 7,800 pounds for inferior heating. The startup cost was more than recovered by operational efficiency. The science was elegant because it was ancient. Roman engineers, building hypocost systems for bathhouses from Britain to Syria, had optimized these principles through centuries of iteration. They understood that stone could be a battery for heat. That radiant warmth was superior to convective heating. That massive thermal mass, properly designed, could store solar and combustion heat and release it slowly, steadily, effectively. Duncan McLeod hadn't invented anything. He'd simply remembered something the frontier had forgotten, and he'd adapted it brilliantly to the materials and conditions at hand. When Morrison asked him how he'd learned all this, McLeod shrugged. "My grandfather showed me stone that stayed warm. I understood what it meant. The rest is just building what the stone wants to do anyway." That might have been the most profound statement of all. The recognition that the material itself has properties and preferences, and that good engineering means working with those properties rather than against them. By late February 1878, 17 cabins within 50 miles had begun incorporating variations of McLeod's hypocost design. The adaptations varied by builder skill and available materials, but the core principle remained: maximize thermal mass beneath the living space, force combustion gases through stone channels before allowing chimney escape, and create radiant floor heating rather than relying solely on convective fireplace heat. Samuel Bradley was among the first converts. That spring, he dismantled his existing fireplace and foundation, excavating beneath his cabin to install a simplified 4-channel system. His wife complained about the disruption. Tearing apart a functional home to rebuild based on a neighbor's experiment seemed reckless. But Bradley had spent that January watching his children shiver while McLeod's family lived in comfort, and he'd done the mathematics on cordwood consumption. His modified system, completed by October 1878, used only 4,800 pounds of stone compared to McLeod's 6,400, a more modest thermal mass that nonetheless transformed his cabin's performance. That winter, Bradley's interior temperatures averaged 61 degrees Fahrenheit during cold snaps, a 15-degree improvement over the previous year, while his wood consumption dropped by 35%. Henry Morrison took a different approach. Rather than excavating beneath an existing structure, he designed his new cabin from the ground up around a hypocost system. His innovation was incorporating the thermal mass into the cabin's foundation walls, as well as the floor channels, creating a heat battery that surrounded the living space on 5 sides. The system required nearly 9,000 pounds of stone and 3 months of construction, but the results were extraordinary. Interior temperatures of 72 degrees Fahrenheit during the harshest cold, maintained on just 70 pounds of daily cordwood consumption. Word spread beyond Watauga County. By 1880, builders in the mountain regions of Virginia and Tennessee were experimenting with McLeod floors or hot stone foundations. The designs diverged as different communities adapted the principle to local conditions and materials. Some used slate instead of sandstone. Others created simpler 2-channel systems for smaller cabins. A few ambitious builders in the Shenandoah Valley constructed community gathering halls with elaborate hypocost networks beneath plank floors that could accommodate 50 people in winter comfort. The economic impact was measurable. In regions where cordwood collection consumed substantial labor, either family time or purchased wood, the fuel savings translated directly to improved survival margins. Families using hypocost systems could maintain comfort on 40 to 60% less wood, freeing time and resources for other essential tasks. In particularly harsh winters, when wood supplies ran critically short, the efficiency difference became literally life-saving. Duncan MacLeod himself became a sought-after consultant. He traveled to nearby homesteads and settlements, advising on channel dimensions, stone selection, and firebox design. He charged modestly, sometimes just a meal and a place to sleep, because he viewed the knowledge as communal property, not personal invention. Romans built this 2,000 years ago. He'd remind people. I just remembered it. His own system continued performing flawlessly year after year. In 1883, 5 years after initial construction, MacLeod opened his foundation for inspection by a visiting engineer from Raleigh who was documenting mountain building techniques. The engineer, Thomas Whitmore, measured the system's performance across a 2-week period in January and recorded his findings in a report that would later influence institutional building design in the region. Whitmore's measurements confirmed what mountain families already knew empirically. MacLeod's cabin maintained 68 degrees Fahrenheit interior temperature on 85 pounds of daily cordwood during weather that forced conventional homes to burn 180 pounds to achieve 48 degrees Fahrenheit. The efficiency ratio was 3.7 to 1. MacLeod extracted nearly 4 times as much useful heating from the same fuel input. Perhaps more significantly, Whitmore noted the system's longevity. After 5 years of continuous use, the stone channels showed minimal deterioration. The sandstone had darkened from smoke exposure, but retained structural integrity. The mortar joints remained tight. The system required no repairs beyond annual chimney cleaning, maintenance that any wood-burning system demanded regardless of design. This is not experimental technology, Whitmore wrote. It is proven technology that modern construction has abandoned to its detriment. The efficiency gains are not marginal. They're transformative. Any builder constructing permanent dwellings in cold climates who ignores these principles is either ignorant or negligent. Not everyone adopted the technology. Hypocost systems required substantially more upfront labor and skill than conventional fireplaces. They required stone in quantities that weren't always available. They required builders willing to learn techniques outside the standard frontier carpentry repertoire. And they required homeowners willing to manage a different kind of fire, the twice-daily hot burns rather than the continuous low fires most people maintained. The learning curve caused failures. A homesteader in Tennessee built channels without proper gradient and created a system that filled his cabin with smoke. Another in Virginia used exclusively granite, chosen for its availability, and discovered that granite's lower heat capacity made the system far less effective than sandstone equivalents. These failures became cautionary tales that slowed adoption in some regions. But where the systems were built correctly, they transformed winter survival. Families who installed hypocost heating consistently reported not just warmer homes, but changes in winter quality of life. Children could play on warm floors instead of huddling near hearths. Women could work at tables across the room from the fire. Elderly family members, for whom cold was particularly dangerous, survived winters they might not have otherwise. Duncan MacLeod lived in his cabin until his death in 1904 at age 71. The hypocost system he'd built in 1877 was still functioning when his grandson inherited the property in 1906. It continued heating the cabin effectively until 1923, when the structure was finally abandoned. Not because the heating system failed, but because the family had relocated to more accessible lowland farms. In 1968, a graduate student in architectural history located the ruins of MacLeod's cabin during research on vernacular mountain building. The foundation stones were still there, buried under decades of leaf litter and fallen timber. The channels were intact. The student, Margaret Shun, excavated portions of the system and documented its construction in her master's thesis, Thermal Mass Heating in Appalachian Frontier Architecture. Chen's thesis noted something profound. MacLeod's system, built with 1870s materials and technology, achieved radiant floor heating efficiency comparable to modern hydronic systems that cost thousands of dollars to install. The principle was identical: thermal mass beneath the living surface, slowly releasing stored heat. MacLeod had simply used stone and wood fire instead of water pipes and gas furnaces. Modern off-grid builders and sustainable architecture advocates have rediscovered these principles in recent decades. Rocket mass heaters, thermal battery systems, and high-efficiency radiant floor designs all echo what Duncan MacLeod built in 1877. Engineers now calculate with precision what MacLeod understood intuitively. Massive thermal storage, properly implemented, transforms heating efficiency by decoupling heat generation from heat delivery. The irony is inescapable. We spent a century advancing to forced air heating systems that blast hot air through buildings inefficiently, losing heat through ductwork and creating uncomfortable temperature gradients. We invented electric baseboard heaters that consume enormous energy to maintain barely adequate warmth. We built millions of homes that require continuous energy input to stay comfortable, burning fossil fuels at staggering rates to overcome fundamental design inefficiency. And all along, the Romans had already solved the problem. Duncan MacLeod had remembered the solution. The stone beneath frontier cabins had proven it worked. If this story has shown you something about heat, efficiency, and the wisdom we've forgotten in our rush toward modern solutions, hit that like button one final time. Subscribe if you want more historical engineering that challenges what we think we know about survival and building. And comment below. Tell me where you're watching from and whether you'd consider installing a system like this if you were building off-grid. Because sometimes the oldest technologies are the smartest ones, and the people who remembered them weren't primitive. They were brilliant. The lesson wasn't just about heating. It was about humility, about recognizing that traditional knowledge, passed through generations and proven across centuries, often contains engineering principles more sophisticated than contemporary practice. About understanding that primitive sometimes means elegantly simple rather than inferior. Samuel Bradley, before his death in 1891, admitted something to his son that captured this realization. I called Duncan MacLeod a fool for digging beneath his cabin. I thought I knew better because I'd built 17 homes and he'd built none in these mountains. But he knew stone, and stone doesn't lie. I was the fool, too certain of my own experience to learn from his knowledge. That confession could serve as an epitaph for countless modern builders who've dismissed ancient techniques as outdated, only to rediscover through expensive failure what those old methods already solved. Duncan MacLeod's underground fire, his stone labyrinth that turned Roman engineering into frontier survival technology, stands as proof that the wisest builders aren't always the ones with the newest techniques. Sometimes they're the ones who remember what worked before and why it worked, and how to make it work again in new circumstances. The warmth rising through that oak plank floor in January 1878 wasn't just physical heat. It was the warmth of knowledge preserved, adapted, and proven. It was the heat of stone that remembered, in a cabin built by a man who understood that the oldest technologies survive because they're not primitive, they're perfected. This script presents historical building techniques for educational and documentary purposes. Hypocost and thermal mass heating systems require proper engineering, adequate ventilation, and compliance with modern building codes and safety standards. Any implementation should involve qualified professionals and appropriate permits. The historical examples described represent period construction practices and should not be considered direct building advice for contemporary projects.